You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Max Planck Lawcast. Now, unless you've been living under a rock for the last year or so, if you any way, shape or form followed the German news, then you will certainly have heard about the concept of Bürgergeld. Bürgergeld, which translates roughly to citizens' income or citizens' benefit, is a major reworking of Germany's unemployment system that was introduced at the beginning of 2023. The concept was developed by Olaf Scholz's coalition government to replace its predecessor, which went by the somewhat unwieldy name of Arbeitslosengeld II, and which was commonly referred to as Hartz IV. Confused? Me too. Compared to its predecessor, Bürgergeld has done away with a number of sanctions that were deemed unfair and counterproductive. But, as with all change, not everyone is impressed by this new approach. In preparing for today's podcast, I looked over the comments section of a number of mainstream news sources, and it's fair to say that the picture didn't seem all that rosy. A slap in the face for hard-working taxpayers, decried one commentator. Another pointed out that our economy desperately needs workers, and what does the government go and do? It rewards idleness. One commentator even went so far as to suggest that Bürgergeld is a climate protection project of the Green Party. If you no longer have to drive to work, you don't emit any carbon dioxide. I'm happy to say that there were a few lone warriors out there who tried to bring down the rhetoric a notch or two, such as this one here who noted, the amount of money that people receive on Bürgergeld isn't the problem. Rather, the main issue is the fact that the low minimum wage makes Bürgergeld too attractive. Well, as you can see, there's lots of different opinions out there on Bürgergeld, and that's where the Lawcast steps in. To break the concept of Bürgergeld down, with more reason and less emotion, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Rick Sallaba. Rick is a researcher at the Planck Institute for Social Law and Social Policy in Munich, and he's recently authored a number of papers on the topic of Bürgergeld. Rick, thank you so much for joining us today on the Lawcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, I think it's fair to say that Bürgergeld is a large and complex topic. I'm aware that we're not going to be able to cover everything today. I know it's a hard ask, but maybe you can begin by explaining the concept of Bürgergeld as clearly for laymen as possible and how it differs from the previous minimum income system.
Yes, citizens' income is indeed not an entirely uncomplex subject. If we are to talk about these benefits here, we must remain aware that we can only focus on a few key points. Like its predecessor, the citizen's income is a subordinate benefit. That means that own assets or income from gainful employment or insurance claims, such as Unemployment Benefit 1, exclude or at least reduce the entitlement. People who do not reach the subsistence threshold, despite having their own resources, are entitled to so-called top-up benefits. We call them Aufstocker.
Oh, okay. So you can also, topping up, it doesn't mean purely receiving benefits just alone. Benefits can also be used as a top-up for a lower income.
Yes, that's true.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
One could call this demand for the missing of own resources a vertical limit of access. Beside this vertical limit, there are also horizontal limits. Citizens' income is one part of a bigger system of livelihood protection schemes. For asylum seekers, students, the elderly, and people with reduced working capacities, there are other similar function entitlements which exclude the entitlement for citizens' benefit. A core element of this system is the comparison of personal resources, in other words, income and assets, and personal needs. Most of the modifications can be explained around this cornerstone.
Okay, so this cornerstone then involving income, assets, and personal needs, was it?
Yeah, that's right.
So we've got this cornerstone and income, assets, and personal needs. Maybe tell us a little bit more about how this forms the nub or the heart of Bürgergeld.
The personal needs are made up of a statistically determined standard need, housing costs, and additional needs such as pregnancy. The statistical method for determining the standard needs was changed. Price changes of substantial goods are now taken into account to a greater extent, which has led to a significant increase in benefits. For housing costs, they introduced a waiting period, Under the predecessor, accommodation costs were limited to a reasonable amount. The rating period now suspends the adequacy test for 1 year, so also not adequate amounts can be taken over by the system, but one has to keep in mind this is a legal term.
Okay, so that's judging what someone needs for their accommodation purposes.
Yeah, what can be expected to be carried out by the system.
So what the state is willing to cover. If you're living in a castle, maybe the state is not willing to cover the castle and the heating costs. But if it's a reasonable, an apartment, say in Berlin or Munich, that can be covered.
That's right. This is a good example.
Okay, radio.
On the income and asset side, some additional relaxations have been made. First of all, the so-called Freibetrag for employed persons was increased. For people upholding a job training, they introduced also a new Freibetrag.
Just going to have to stop you there, Rick. Can you tell me what exactly is a Freibetrag?
The Freibetrag relates to a part of the income which is exempt from the calculation. This is intended to put the working in a better position than unemployed.
So even if I'm working and I earn a certain amount of money, there's a limit of using that to be calculating my assets. I have a certain protected amount of money I can earn.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's related to the income, but yeah, you have a protected amount of money you can earn and don't have to use. But there is no good translation to this, so I just call it Freibetrag.
Okay, sure thing.
But then we can come to the asset side, and the waiting period I just mentioned was also introduced for the assessment of assets. Assets up to 40,000 euros don't have to be used. For every member of the so-called Bedarfsgemeinschaft, this amount is raised by 15,000 euros.
Okay.
Yes, that was a very, very brief overview with existing changes. I didn't cover it all, but I think this is like the main concept.
Okay, understood. There's another German term that popped up there, Bedarfsgemeinschaft. Does that translate to roughly a family then, or people living under one roof?
Yes, it's a specific term. One could translate it to community of need. It's more than a family, and it's less than just living under one roof.
Okay, so you've kind of given us a rundown there about some of the changes that have come about here, the waiting periods, the Freibetrag, the Bedarfsgemeinschaft, the assets. What would you say then were even the key motivations, though, for Olaf Scholz's coalition government to undertake such a, I guess you would say, large-scale reworking of the previous system? And why was there this push to introduce the concept of Bürgergeld?
For a legal scholar, this question is not so easy to answer. First of all, there are always the personal views of individual participants, which do not necessarily coincide with the motivations of the group. Furthermore, there are always political and historical events in the background, the relevance of which is not always directly formulated. But I think one could especially point out two motivations. Mm-hmm. The first one is of a more technical nature, even if it is the reason for many complaints about the rising amount of the benefit. With the corona crisis and energy crisis, price jumps for the cost of living weren't sufficiently recognized in the system anymore. This led to a constitutionally backed, this is important, requirement for a better statistical mechanism. The adoptions within the sanction system were also due to constitutional rulings.
Okay, so you're saying that not all the changes were simply because Olaf Scholz and his government said, hey, we need to change the system. Rather, there was also some judicial nudging or involved as well from the Constitutional Court.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. With the previous system where they said this doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
The second motivation is of a more political or substantial nature. The predecessor of the unemployment benefit was a combination of the so-called unemployment help and social help. Both schemes were considered as focusing too much on the receipt rather than overcoming the situation of need. In combination with a general shift to the so-called activation policies, the obligation for labor market integration were tightened. For many people, this resulted in a shortage of benefits and a higher pressure to accept low-paying and unqualified jobs. Most of these jobs are due to their characteristics not very sustainable. Misconduct was punished by a partial shortening of benefits up to a complete exclusion from the benefit scheme. Mm-hmm. The citizens' income tries to loosen things up a little bit, especially by giving the unemployed opportunity to gain professional qualification and find more sustainable employments.
So it sounds like a lot of the sanction-based system or sanctions have been removed from the system. Is that correct?
Not removed, but they are not so strict anymore.
Okay.
Let's put it like this.
Okay, yeah, sure. Would you say that this reflects a broader societal shift to how we as a society would like to deal with unemployment? Or Do you think that the government might have overshot the mark here?
I don't think this was an either-or situation. The political statements on the sanctions regime often ignore the constitutional requirements for the restrictions. The new regulation implements the requirements of the Federal Constitutional Court, which found the strict sanctions to be disproportionate. There are some regulations which are wider than the constitutional requirements, especially that the first invitation for the cooperation agreement has to be given out with any threat of sanctions. So if you don't go there to the bargaining process the first time, you wouldn't get any sanction. Or that the sanction time is not starting with a 3-month reduction straight away, but with 1 month. I wouldn't regard this as a change of paradigm. Besides that, political actors who demand higher sanctions view the constitutional burden of proving a positive impact of higher sanctions onto the integration process. The Federal Constitutional Court has left the legislator the option of cutting unemployment benefits completely in the event of a refusal to work.
Mm-hmm.
This card was not initially drawn in the Citizens' Income Act, but the same government which introduced the Citizens' Income now discusses about the implementation of such a rule, and the Bundestag already agreed, and the Bundesrat will decide soon, and it's quite clear that the 100% sanction will come. So in conclusion, I wouldn't see a shift, and I don't see any overshot. Instead, I recognize the realization of constitutional requirements.
Okay, Rick, so just a quick question before we go to our break. That means, though, that if I've understood correctly, 100% sanction, or at least for a period of benefits being removed, will be made possible in the near future if you refuse to take on a job. Is that correct?
Yeah, it has a big concrete job offer, but if you turn it down, then yes.
Okay, right. So a lot of this that I was talking about before, where it's like, oh, you can sit at home with your feet up and no worries, you'll get paid, is actually not going to be correct in the near future.
Yes.
Okay, right. Wonderful. Well, don't go away. I'm going to be back with Rick after this very short break.
Welcome to Max Planck Law, one of the world's largest networks for legal research, based in Germany. Our world-class institutes invite applications for fully funded PhD and postdoc opportunities in almost any area of law. Join a thriving community of over 400 researchers in an international and interdisciplinary environment. Experience the high quality of life that Germany offers while collaborating with colleagues across institutes, working and writing in English. We provide you with unique specialist libraries, excellent workspaces, and support in developing your research and your academic career. Apply today. For more information, visit law.mpg.de.
Well, welcome back to the Lawcast. Before the break, I talked with Rick about positive, or well, not just the positive, but we talked about a lot of the positive elements of Bürgergeld. I can 100% see that these reforms offer a new, novel approach, but I'm going to have to flip the script here, Rick, and look at a number of elephants in the room when it comes to these new reforms. Are you ready for this?
Yes.
Alrighty. So, this kind of refers back to some of those comments I read at the very start of the podcast. Let's then begin with elephant number one, which is probably the biggest elephant of them all, namely the claim that's often heard that, hey, Bürgergeld, it disincentivizes people from even looking for work, especially lower paid jobs. What's your take on this?
There are many factors that influence work incentives. In addition to tax regulations, the conditions of the labor market are, of course, also relevant. But in general, we have to divide between two groups, and this is really important. First, when we have an isolated look at the relation between working recipients and non-working recipients, the answer is quite clear. If you work, you get more.
Okay.
Because not your whole income is taken into account, like we heard before, when the income is calculated.
The Freibetrag, right?
This was the Freibetrag.
Yes, okay. Mm-hmm.
Around about 20% of your income between 100 euro and 520 euro, 30% of your income between 520 and 1,000 euro, and 10% of your income between 1,000 and 1,200 euros can be held back. There are also another Freibetrag, but this is the major one I just mentioned.
Understood, yeah.
Another question is the difference between a full-time working person at minimum wage and a non-working recipient. The difference between those didn't really change, as the development of minimum wage is still better than the development of citizens' benefits. The Wirtschafts- and Sozialwissenschaftliche Institut, WSI, calculated that the difference between working and citizens' income, depending on the concrete living situation, this is always important, is between 271 euro and up to 914 euro. For a single household, the difference is 532 euro. It must be judged by everyone individually if this is a considerable difference. But a constitutional obligation to uphold a certain distance does not exist. Some people think that, but there is no obligation to hold up any difference. It's a purely political thing.
Okay, right. What you're saying is there's definitely, if there's a working household and a household who receives Bürgergeld there, that's not legally required. There is a political will that has been installed to ensure that any household which is working receives more money than a household on Bürgergeld.
Yes, but when we follow the WSI, the difference exists. So in practice, we have this distance. I mean, it has to be mentioned that the outcome depends on the institute questioned. The Institute of Weltwirtschaft in Kiel does conclude in an older inquiry lower amounts, also negative outcomes, but they're also calculated with higher living expenses. They're calculated with the rent of Hamburg.
Okay.
Yes.
So it could happen that our family could earn more on Bürgergeld or than a working family, or not?
At least if we follow the Weltwirtschaft in Kiel and we have very high rents in a city, then it could be possible.
Okay, and that's because the part of Bürgergeld is also covers, as you mentioned before, a reasonable rent.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in the first year, even every rent.
Okay. Even my castle.
Even your castle, but it is in discussion if there should be a limit when we make an interpretation of the law.
Now, elephant number 2. I'm going to ask you about Bürgergeld and actually the semantics, I guess, of Bürgergeld, which, as we've kind of referred to, means citizens' income. I looked a little bit at the statistics when it comes to who is currently receiving Bürgergeld, and it is actually not, in fact, being paid purely to German citizens. Actually, according to kind of the latest statistics, nearly half of the recipients are non-German citizens, or not German citizens. Do you think that there's a danger that this could slowly erode the legitimacy and acceptance of Bürgergeld?
I think we must divide this question into 2.
Okay.
Yes, the name Bürgergeld is not fitting. Not everybody who is recipient of citizens' income is a citizen, and not every citizen is in the citizens' income scheme. But so was the name unemployment benefit too. As we have seen, unemployed people can also receive citizens' benefit or unemployment benefit too, so they are not unemployed. So the name is purely symbolic to show that a change of culture is intended, but there is no
okay, right. I see.
Semantic perfection behind it.
Understood. Okay.
So can the distribution of benefits to non-citizens erode the legitimacy and acceptance of citizens' benefits? When we look at it from a perspective of the Constitution, then no, because in principle, everybody has the right to a dignified life. There are possibilities for diverging modalities, but they have to be backed by different typical needs. In most cases, there won't be any legitimate scope. Also, one has to see that people without a residence allowance have no access to the scheme. Furthermore, one has to observe that at the moment around 700,000 of these non-citizens are Ukrainians affected by war, which we grant extra social protection. Also, we have to keep the amount of top-ups, Aufstocker, and the amount of members who aren't able to work in mind, mainly children.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, we've got these bare bones statistics, which says there is this a number of people on Bürgergeld, German citizens, non-German citizens, but that's probably not actually the most appropriate way to judge the legitimacy then of Bürgergeld.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, because you have, as I say, children, people living in the, what was the Gemeinschaft called again? The
Bedarfsgemeinschaft,
the community of need, and also people who are topping up, or workers who are topping up their income on Bürgergeld are also included in the statistic, even though they're not receiving 100% state benefits.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Then I'm going to hit you with another one, a third and final elephant, which has to do with, I guess, the concept of universal basic income. I think what's become evident today is that even with the Bürgergeld reforms, the German welfare state or the system is complex and probably difficult for anyone involved to navigate. What about the introduction of universal basic income? Would that not be the simplest and least bureaucratic way to ensure that all people living in Germany, regardless of their citizenship, so long as they have a residence status, have a base amount of money to avoid poverty?
I wouldn't consider this as an elephant, more like a blue whale. So
okay.
I can only formulate some problems coming with it, but I won't give you the answers.
Why would you say a blue whale?
Because it's a big topic, and I think to discuss this, we would need a whole another podcast.
Oh, okay. Radio, understood.
First of all, there is, of course, the problem of financing. You cannot really make detailed prognosis here because it depends on how high the universal basic income is and which side benefits get cancelled.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still have a public health insurance? Do you still have pensions? Or do people have to get these services on private basis? And then for which price can these public goods be offered?
Okay.
Also, one has to see the side effects of universal basic income on the economic situation. Does a universal basic income increase the economic growth or does it harm to it? Realistically, a universal basic income is never universal in a strict sense. Will everybody get access or only real citizens, and which schemes will apply for non-citizens? Furthermore, how will the collective personality develop? Will there be even more individualism because you don't have to engage with your peers anymore? Or will there be more time for community activities?
Okay. Well, they are legalizing marijuana right now in April in Germany, so maybe that's a communal activity that everyone will have time for.
Yes.
When they're receiving universal basic income.
Or people will work even less.
Yes, that's right.
Getting
exactly.
lazy. So,
as you say about okay, so there's far more to it than simply money for all and no problems.
Yes, of course. And also, how do we organize the labor market in the following process? Will it be more liberal, or do we still hold on minimum wage and fair working conditions?
Okay.
But the most interesting and most difficult question for me, and the prior one for all others, because it's a pathway thing, is how do we want to have our economic reproduction be organized? Do we want to give up the ideal of a labor market and economy which is organized in a way that it guarantees social justice within the reproduction cycle? Or do we give up on a fair transaction and rule everything over secondary redistribution? So primary distribution or secondary redistribution. The second option probably could divide our society into two systems. And furthermore, we have to ask, do you really acknowledge the worth and the dignity of work if we stop trying to focus on a fair labor market and source it out, so to say?
What you're saying is that this would even be maybe a bridge too far at the moment without we would have to take major societal repercussions and the way we view work into account before going about introducing this blue whale of universal basic income.
Yes, I mean, we can do this or we can think about this, but I think we have to answer this question and then the other questions follow out of it. And this is important.
Okay. Understood. I do like the concept as such. It's an interesting concept, but I do get it that maybe it sounds great on paper, but the reality is different. I know there are a number of studies at the moment where they are looking at what happens. I think they're taking a pilot project, giving maybe 1,000 people universal basic income, and then following them for a year or 3, I think. Yeah. So yeah.
Also, the Max Planck Society has researchers on this.
Okay, right. I see. Well, Rick, I guess it's been now a year pretty much to the day, early January, the reforms were introduced, Bürgergeld. Would you say that there's evidence to suggest that it's been beneficial to job seekers and the economy at large?
This is a very difficult question to answer because it's not easy to track the empirical influence of law reforms on economic situations. I mean, this is not a problem of Bürgergeld, but a problem in general.
Okay.
But regarding the general development, according to the statistic of the Bundesagentur für Arbeit for 2023, the economic growth slowed down slightly in relation to the previous year. Unemployment has generally risen, while long-term unemployment has fallen slightly.
Okay.
Integration measures implemented also fell slightly compared to the previous year. The number of recipients of citizens' income has risen, but this was to be expected due to the increase in needs, of course.
Sure, and what you also mentioned previously as well, that it's not just the statistics on paper, but there's a lot of other kind of factors in play in the background.
The Institute of Arbeitsmarkt- und Berufsforschung, IAB, has published a report on the effectiveness of the reform in August. Due to their findings, they expect a better integration in the labor market due to the better focus on education, coaching, and the bonus for attending an educational course. But like the regulation on sanctions, the bonus is now under discussion too, and probably will be kicked out of the citizens' benefits.
The bonus is for doing extra courses.
Yes.
Okay, right.
A money bonus.
Okay, yes, I see.
Also, these studies are qualitative, so we don't have any hard numbers.
So it's a matter of, it's probably difficult to look at them. You can't look at these reforms in a vacuum, is what you're saying, because there's so many other influences going around there, yeah.
Yes, definitely. That's the point. You can't really track the causality here.
Okay, right. And do you think at some point in time the causality will be able to be understood better, or is that something that's just not possible?
I mean, I'm not an economist, but I don't think that we will get hard numbers.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Well, Rick, I guess that brings us to the conclusion for today's episode on the Bürgergeld and the reforms. I hope that we were able to keep our promise to the listeners to break the concepts down. I mean, they're clearly complex, but I think you did an admirable job doing so with more reason and less emotion. And for that, I'm extremely thankful. I guess what became clear to me is that in the media, as I say, when preparing for the podcast, there's definitely, I don't know if disinformation goes too far, but there's certainly a lot of opinions swirling and circulating about the Bürgergeld reforms. But your answers kind of clearly demonstrated the importance of information, clear, hard facts for political reasoning and social discourse. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and
thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're more than welcome. It was, as I say, it was definitely interesting. It was, it's not the easiest concept to wrap your head around, but I thank you for taking the time to talk through things with us. I gather you've published 2 papers on the topic. Is that correct, or more?
Yes, one in French and one in English.
Oh, okay, right. I see. Oh, we can, and then you go into more detail there probably as well, right?
Yes, okay. It's more detailed. I mean, it's, as we have seen, it's a technical subject. So, and we only covered some things. So one has to really look up deep into it and then and understand it and then evaluate.
Sure, certainly.
How do we think about the reforms?
Yeah, but as I say, I thought it was a good discussion. I enjoyed it, and I definitely look forward to our next podcast together in which you tell me more about the blue whale that is universal income. So until then, all the very best with the rest of your research on Bürgergeld, Rick.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.